Hello everyone, welcome back to the course Introduction to Infrastructure Asset Management. This course is offered under MOOCs, an initiative of Government of India. In this course, we started our discussion on a generic process for infrastructure management, where we discussed that the first step is data collection. We understood that data is an important piece in the decision making. We saw that there are different types of data, there are different categories of data. We need to go about prioritizing them. Then, in the last lecture, we discussed that what are the ways to handle missing data. Now, in this particular lecture, we will be discussing about role and importance of qualitative data. This lecture is the fifth lecture within this week, where we started our discussion on infrastructure asset management framework and the role of data. The discussion in the lecture till now might have given an impression that we are only focusing on quantitative data, that is numerical data or numbers. But it is important to note that in addition to quantitative data, oftentimes there is qualitative data which can be collected. So, the idea of this lecture is to communicate that qualitative data is as important as quantitative data. We'll talk about it in detail. Before going there, let us just get an idea what is qualitative data and what is quantitative data. So, before we discuss the importance of qualitative data, let us understand what is the difference between qualitative data and quantitative data. Quantitative data, as all of us understand, includes numerical data. So, you have values here. On the other side, qualitative data is more descriptive in nature. So, generally you have texts, figures, etc., which are explaining. So, quantitative data is more numerical in nature, qualitative data is descriptive. Moving on, the purpose of quantitative data is to understand how much or how many. So, we are looking into some form of measure. We want to assess how much or how many. On the other hand, the purpose of qualitative data is to understand why or how. So, in case of qualitative data, we are collecting descriptive data to understand why something is happening, how something is happening. On the other hand, in case of quantitative data, we are trying to understand by how much it is happening, how many times it is happening, and so on. So, I hope the purpose of qualitative data and quantitative data is clear. Moving on, quantitative data is mostly numerical data and it can be collected using several methods, like you can perform experiments, you can have some sensors installed which are collecting the data, you can have equipments to do this, or you can have some surveys which are rating based. So, you are asking different people to rate something on a scale of say 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. So, again you are collecting quantitative data. Then you can have numerical questions where you are asking people some numerical questions where answers are in numbers. For example, you ask someone what is your age, or you ask someone how many years of experience do you have. So, all these are numerical questions because the answers will be in numbers. These are some of the methods to collect quantitative data. On the other side, in case of qualitative data, we try to do interviews or observations. Here, instead of asking a very straightforward numerical question, you ask a more open-ended question where the answer or response will be in form of sentences. In case of observations, we go to a particular site and observe what is going on and we record that information. That is again qualitative information. Also, we can do case studies. We can do panel discussion where you invite several people to sit in a room and discuss on a topic. You also employ something known as a Delphi technique. So, these are all the methods to collect qualitative data. Then the method of analysis for numerical data is mostly statistical. All those measures of mean, median, mode, hypothesis testing, etc. can be done on quantitative data. On the other hand, to process qualitative data, we rely on thematic analysis or qualitative content analysis. Finally, any quantitative data has an advantage that it is highly objective and is replicable. Replicable means if multiple individuals are asking the same question, it is possible that they will get the same answer. Or if you have multiple equipments collecting the same information, you will have more or less the same information which is collected as long as the equipments are calibrated. However, one issue is it lacks conceptual depth. Any quantitative data doesn't have any conceptual depth. So, for example, if you ask a person who has an age of 50, how many years of experience do you have? And he responds with 3. Now, you have quantitative data that you have a person who is aged 50 but only has 3 years of experience. But you do not have any conceptual understanding of what is the reason behind this, why experience is low, and so on. So, that is one of the limitation of quantitative data. On the other side, qualitative data helps us in doing an in-depth analysis. In this case, we have a lot more information available where we can do a more refined understanding and we can develop an in-depth understanding of the topic in hand. However, the issue with qualitative data is it is often subjective. There are chances of more biasness in case of qualitative data. I hope the difference between qualitative data and quantitative data is clear. Now, let us understand when will we prefer qualitative data over quantitative data. So, the question is, how do you choose what type of data should we collect? Should we collect quantitative data or qualitative data? The answer lies in following aspects. First of all, if your goals and objectives are exploratory in nature, where you want to develop an understanding of something, then qualitative data is preferred. On the other hand, if you want to do a more confirmatory exploration, where you want to do things like hypothesis testing, or if you have an assumption which you want to test, you can actually go for quantitative data because you already have a question in mind. You will collect relevant information around that and then you will do a quantitative analysis. So, for exploratory goals where the questions are not clear, you are just trying to develop a broader understanding, you prefer qualitative data. Moreover, in all those cases where quantitative data is not available and cannot be collected, for example, say there is some temporal data which you have not collected on time. Now, there is no way to recollect that data because the time has already lapsed. So, now you can do a more exploratory analysis where you ask relevant experts, participants about the information. You try to understand what they are seeing because you assume that these participants were there during that time. They might have observed something. So, although the data is not available, but we can do a more qualitative understanding to basically fill the gaps. So, the idea is if quantitative data is missing or cannot be collected, we prefer qualitative data. Also, in any situation where in-depth understanding is required, you prefer qualitative data. Actually, you prefer a mixed type of a set where you have both qualitative as well as quantitative data. Here, I am just trying to say that you prefer a qualitative data for a more in-depth understanding. Qualitative data comes at its own cost. It is often time intensive. It requires a lot of data collection and data processing. So, it is a costly affair, but it helps us in doing an in-depth analysis. Moreover, the whole idea of choosing qualitative or quantitative data is if you want to understand trends, then you go for quantitative data because quantitative data will reveal trends. You can see if something is increasing with time, something is decreasing with time, is something changing with time, and so on. However, if you want to know the reason behind this trend, then you need to go for qualitative data. For example, let us take a case of a metro project. Now, if you want to understand the ridership data in metros over time, you can use quantitative data. Quantitative data will give you an information that what has been the ridership over years. Using that data, you can say that number of passengers who are traveling in a metro have gone up or gone down over years. However, say you see that the number of passengers using metros has gone down. Now, if you want to understand what is the reason behind this trend, then you need to collect more qualitative data. You need to reach out to different people who are using metros. You need to ask them relevant questions. You might want to interview them. You want to understand what is the reason behind decrease in ridership. So, quantitative data is used for identifying trends where you are crunching numbers to see some trends. On the other hand, qualitative data is used to understand the reason behind these trends. Having said that, even qualitative data can be used to understand different types of trends. For example, you have a question which you have asked to 100 people and their responses are recorded in the form of interview documents. Now, you can process these documents to actually come up with a trend where you might say that on processing 100 documents, I saw that a group of people who are coming from a particular region often talk about an aspect in negative sense. So, now you have processed qualitative data to understand some of the trends. So, I hope the idea is clear. When do we prefer qualitative data over quantitative data? Now, let us see how qualitative data plays a role in infrastructure decision making. Infrastructure decision making employs both qualitative as well as quantitative data. Oftentimes, we do not have all the quantitative data available with us. We have to rely on qualitative data to develop a better understanding. So, qualitative data is critical for infrastructure decision making. The idea is infrastructure is always for the society, and in order to better understand the society, we cannot just rely on quantitative data. Sometimes we have to go for qualitative data to develop a better understanding. So, qualitative data in case of infrastructure decision making can be used for first understanding community needs, their values, their perspectives. You want to understand what does a user prefer, what does he cherish, and so on. So, you need qualitative data for this. Then you also want to capture community voices. So, you do things like public consultations for any urban decision making. Here again you have to rely on qualitative data. It is very difficult to quantify some of these things. You have to ask a more open-ended question to understand what does a community need. Moreover, it also helps in defining agency goals, objectives, challenges, etc. An agency might have quantitative goals, quantitative objectives, and so on. But the idea is first you need to understand their vision and mission, which is more qualitative in nature. And then you try to identify some quantitative measures which can be used to communicate the qualitative goals. So, qualitative data is important to understand what does an agency want, what are its objectives, what are its challenges, and so on. Further, qualitative data is required to evaluate a community's preparedness and their resilience. Moreover, qualitative data can be used for filling data gaps. So, if you have a lot of quantitative data, but there are some missing values. In the last lecture, we discussed some of the ways of handling missing values. One other way to handle missing values could be that instead of doing any quantitative approximation, we actually go ahead and do a qualitative understanding. We ask some of the relevant questions to relevant participants or experts and use that information to fill the quantitative data. So, that is the reason where mixed methods is applicable in infrastructure decision making. Mixed methods means utilizing both qualitative as well as quantitative data for decision making. So, I hope the message is clear that qualitative data alongside quantitative measures helps us in addressing complex long-term infrastructure challenges, and it also fosters inclusivity. Having discussed the role of qualitative data in infrastructure decision making, let us briefly discuss some of the methods to collect qualitative data. Again, I'll not be going into details of these. I'll just highlight what are the methods available. Each of these methods have their own advantages and disadvantages. There is a lot of literature available around how to conduct these methods thoroughly. So, first such method is interviews. In case of interviews, first you develop an interview protocol. You try to understand what is the objective of an interview, what are the questions which will be asked in the interview. Then you identify the relevant participants. Who are the people who you would like to interview? Then you sit with them, make them comfortable, and ask them relevant questions. At the same time, you take notes. You may record the interview as well. Then you basically analyze the interview responses and then you try to develop an understanding. Next method is observation. In case of observation, basically you go in an environment and you just observe what is going on. So, unlike interviews, here you don't directly involve the other person. Here you just observe that person. So, you go in an environment and just sit and observe them. You make record of what is happening and why is it happening. Here you are not interviewing them, you are not asking them anything. You are just observing and taking notes. Later on, you go over your notes and do a more qualitative understanding of what did you observe. Next, we have a case study. Case study is a broader term which includes review of documents, interviews, observations, and so on. Here, you try to identify a case, you define what is the case, you also define what are you trying to study. You list all your objectives, you collect all the relevant data, which includes both quantitative as well as qualitative data. And then you basically try to analyze this particular case. Based on the findings, you try to generalize these findings for other cases. You might say that the findings which I have from this case study are only applicable to this particular case. It is not applicable to any other case. Or you might say that this is a common case, I have observed one of them, but the findings are generally applicable to other cases as well. Again, I want to reiterate, any qualitative method involves subjectivity. Thus, it is important that a standard, thorough, detailed procedure is followed to collect qualitative data as well as to analyze qualitative data. You want to ensure that there is no biasness in the data which is collected as well as in the analysis or findings that are presented. Moving on, in focus groups, the idea is to discuss a problem with a given set of experts or participants to develop an understanding. Even in focus groups, you have a list of documents where you have records of what different people have said. Then you analyze that data to develop an understanding. You also share your understanding with the group of people who were available for the focus groups. This is part of validation. You try to understand whether you have understood everything correctly. Do the people who were involved in focus groups agree with your observation, and so on. Next, we have a process of analyzing documents. So, instead of doing any interviews, focus groups or observations, you just go by all the documents which are available. Documents can be both public as well as private documents. You go over all the past records, newspaper articles, reports, magazines, journal articles, books, and so on. You try to process this information. There are several tools available to do this. With the advancements in the area of natural language processing, there are a lot of research done in this area where how we can process qualitative data and develop an understanding. So, in case of documents analysis, you are basically going over a lot of documents and you are trying to develop an understanding. You do some kind of a coding here and you try to generate some themes. So, these are some of the methods to collect qualitative data: interviews, observations, case studies, focus groups, and analysis of documents. There are other methods like ethnography, grounded theory, and so on. The idea of this course is not to go into detail of these methods. Here, I just want to communicate that qualitative data is also important for infrastructure decision making. With that, we end our discussion for this particular week, where we heavily focused on the first aspect of the infrastructure management process, which was data collection. We saw role of data, we saw why we need to prioritize data. We also discussed aspects of how to handle missing data, and then in the current lecture, I talked about qualitative data and why qualitative data is important in infrastructure decision making. Now, in the next week, we will dive deeper into performance modeling. In performance modeling, we will see how can we utilize the data which is collected to model the performance of an infrastructure asset. So, students are encouraged to go over these references if you want to learn about this particular topic. With that, I end this lecture here. Thank you. Thanks for listening. Thank you.